I rise to speak to the introduction of the New Zealand-Hong Kong-China Closer Economic Partnership Agreement. Mr Speaker, listening to the Minister just give the introductory speech, one could have been forgiven for nodding off. But I have to say that this is actually a really interesting and quite exciting initiative. And I have a degree of excitement about this that clearly the Minister doesn't share. However, I recognise that it was probably not his own speech and he was filling in for Minister Grosser, who is, even at this moment, tramping the boards overseas on behalf of New Zealand's interests, most particularly in Russia at the moment. And that is another innovation that will be of particular interest to New Zealand exporters. But to get back to the matter in hand, which is the Hong Kong-China Closer Economic Partnership Agreement, Mr Speaker, this is an interesting deal or an agreement that we have reached with Hong Kong. The origins of this go back quite some way. In fact, they go back to 2001, when this was first mooted by Jim Sutton, in fact, who was the Minister of Trade at the time. And we got bogged down, New Zealand and Hong Kong got bogged down in discussions around rules of origin and problems with labelling rules and the rules of origin of goods tended to bring the negotiations to a shuddering halt. And so in 2002 the talks were suspended. But they were revitalised again under Phil Goff as Minister of Trade and pursued with the current Minister, Tim Grosser. And so, as always with these things, Mr Speaker, with these agreements, they are not represented simply in one moment in time when the legislation that is required to enact them is introduced into the House. In fact, this agreement has an almost 10-year pedigree, but it is worth traversing some of the things that will be of benefit to New Zealand. I'd also like to talk about some of the things which sometimes people raise as disadvantages to New Zealand when we strike these free trade agreements, which is essentially what this is, albeit called a Closer Economic Partnership Agreement. First of all, Mr Speaker, as the Minister said, Hong Kong is our 9th largest export market, but just as importantly, it is our 8th largest source of foreign direct investment, and that is significant. We went looking for a high quality outcome in these negotiations, which could be used as a model. An added attraction, of course, was the Chinese Free Trade Agreement, which is already in place. Hong Kong, with its own closer economic partnership with China, in fact, could see that it was a good idea to align the arrangements, the trading arrangements, between itself and New Zealand because of our free trade agreement with China. So this agreement, Mr Speaker, broadly mirrors the Chinese Free Trade Agreement. I want to speak briefly about some of the advantages, and if I have time, some of the disadvantages, but I can pursue that in the minutes that will remain after the House has risen, I imagine, Mr Speaker. There are a number of things that are worth noting. People who are watching this may be interested to know just what it is that New Zealand exports to Hong Kong. Particularly, we export food and beverages, some hides, paper and wood products, and, this will be of interest to one or two people in this House, racehorses. But it is also an important quite mature source market for high-end tourists and for students, both secondary and tertiary students. More specifically, in regards to trade and economic links, New Zealand focuses on encouraging the greater take-up of New Zealand goods and services both in Hong Kong and China, including through partnering with New Zealand enterprises into China, increasing the current levels of investment into New Zealand and encouraging Hong Kong people to see New Zealand as a good place for students to study, whether it's secondary, tertiary or vocational levels, or undertake research. We've also emphasised quite recently the need to encourage research collaboration between New Zealand and Hong Kong research institutions in areas such as nanotechnology, medical research and renewable energy. This agreement also promotes the bilateral working holiday scheme and, of course, promotes New Zealand as a distinct and attractive tourist destination. Mr. Speaker, it's interesting to note that, in fact, when the free trade agreement was signed in Hong Kong, the South China Morning Post, which is a newspaper that is known to anybody who has ever flown a route through Asia from New Zealand, and it made the point in the first paragraph, and that's where one assumes things might be of greatest interest to the people of Hong Kong, that, and I quote, "Hong Kong and New Zealand have ratified a free trade agreement that will allow people travelling on business between the two places to stay for up to 3 months. It also highlights that New Zealand opens its door to more work-as-you-go Hong Kong holidaymakers." Now, there are 2 points immediately, Mr. Speaker, that clearly the Hong Kong media decided were of significance out of this agreement. The fact that business people travelling between the two places can stay for up to 3 months on a business visa is important. Establishing relationships, building networks and moving from Hong Kong into China takes more than a week. It takes more than one trip. And so facilitating longer stays without bureaucratic trammelling is an important consideration in this closer economic partnership. And that is something that New Zealand business people who accompanied the Minister on the visit to Hong Kong at the time of the signing of this free trade agreement were very pleased to see. It was something that made their life easier and facilitated the establishment of businesses and therefore the trade relationship between Hong Kong and New Zealand. It is also, I think, Mr. Speaker,
I regret to advise the member that it's gone just 10 o'clock. This debate is interrupted and set down for resumption next sitting day. Nā reira, tēnā koutou, Paul Marie.